right, so let's get started. So welcome to EIHR's 2025-2026 webinar series, Is Anyone Listening? Literature by and about young people in times of conflict. I'm Kim Klett, the Deputy Director of the Educators Institute for Human Rights. And again, if you haven't already, please feel free to put where you're joining us from in the chat box. So first, I would like to tell you a little bit about EIHR. Taking lessons from the Holocaust and other historic human rights violations, EIHR develops teaching materials, convenes training workshops and summits, and supports educator networks to give secondary students a deeper understanding of how egregious conflicts arise and evolve, how justice is served, and most importantly, how we can prevent future atrocities. We bring these programs to you free of charge and are happy to do so, but we do appreciate any donations you might be able to provide. If you would like to make a donation to help cover costs for our webinars and to support our other programs, please go to the link that will be in the chat box. We also hope that you'll visit our website, eihr.org, to find our many resources, especially for teachers. Thank you for joining us, and if you missed any of our past webinars, you can find them all on our YouTube channel, which will also be dropped into the chat box for your reference. So before we begin, I would like to quickly acknowledge the land where EIHR's office resides. EIHR respectfully acknowledges the Piscataway and Nankachink or Anacostan people and the elders both past and present throughout the generations who have stewarded the land where EIHR gathers. As you listen today, please feel free to drop questions into the chat box. We will also send a follow-up email with the recording of the program, as well as any resources that are mentioned. So today we are thrilled to be joined by EIHR board member and author Alexandra Zapruder. Alex was on the founding staff of the USHMM, where she served on the curatorial team for the museum's exhibition for young visitors, Remember the Children, Daniel's Story. In 2002, Alexandra completed her first book, Salvaged Pages, Young Writers' Diaries of the Holocaust, which won the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category. She curated a permanent exhibition titled And Still I Write, Young Diarists on War and Genocide, which opened at Holocaust Museum Houston in 2019. And she currently serves as the education director of the Defiant Requiem Foundation. Alex is a graduate of Smith College and earned her MA in education at Harvard University in 1995. And she has been published in Parade, LitHub, Smithsonian Magazine, and the New York Times. So Alex, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, I'm so happy to be here.
Oh my gosh, so happy to have you. So let's talk. Everybody, I think on the call probably is familiar with Salvaged Pages, but let's just talk about how the project came to be, kind of the early research you did with that, and some of the challenges maybe that you faced of defining the genre of the book.
Yeah. The project came about because I was a researcher at the Holocaust Museum for Remember the Children. And I was asked to read diaries that had been kept by teenagers at the time in order to help us develop the exhibition labels, which were like a script. It was written in the labels were written in the form of a diary of the main character of the exhibition. And so I reread the Diary of Anne Frank, which was much more moving to me as an adult than it had been when I read it in the seventh grade. And then I was interested in whether there were other diaries, which there were at that time in the early 1990s. There were about, I don't know, 6 or 7 probably that had been translated into English and had been published, but they had all gone out of print. So there were old editions in the museum's library. Yitzhak Rudashevsky, David Rabinowitz, Ava Heyman. There were excerpts of both who were then the anonymous boy and the anonymous girl from Lodz Ghetto, also David Sharakowiak, Moshe Flinker. These were the diaries that had been published and that were known to people who, were scholars in the field. And I read them and I never read anything like like them before. I mean, it wasn't just that they were diaries and the immediacy of the text and the way that, it was such a contrast to the historical perspective that I had been absorbing by studying the Holocaust and looking at photographs and film and testimony. So part of it was the diary part of it, but part of it was that these were young people, and I was just so surprised at how insightful and provocative and interesting they were. I think I underestimated what young people could bring to the public conversation about their own experiences. And I think I'm not alone in that. I feel like that in some ways was the biggest takeaway for me of all the things was, young people are reliable witnesses to their own lives, and they can be reliable witnesses to their own lives. And of course, these were young people who were in a very, coming from a very literary and literate culture. Even a peasant child like David Rabinowitz would have had a good education, a decent education, and he would have been encouraged to read and write. Jews are called people of the book for a reason. And so that means that it's a self-selecting group in some ways, but in other ways, you still have quite a cross-section of writers. It's not only the, city dwellers and wealthy and elite, super privileged among the Jewish population who wrote diaries. There were young people across the spectrum who wrote diaries. And so for me, that it was very interesting to think like, wow, here are all these young people who recorded their life experiences and who had so much to say at such a sophisticated level. What else could be out there? Is there more out there than what I already know? And so I began looking, and the more I looked, the more I found, I was very lucky to be at the Holocaust Museum at that moment in my life. I was in my 20s. I was young. I was energetic. I was just naive enough to think, like, oh, I'll write a book about this. Like, sure, why not? Um, if I had had any idea what was coming, I probably would have hesitated. But um, and then, I mean, just to kind of shift gears to talk a little bit about genre. I mean, what was interesting is that as I gathered the material, it was like dozens and dozens and dozens of diaries from all over Europe, every kind of language, every kind of experience, boys and girls, rich and poor, big families, small families, super Orthodox religious, all the way to totally assimilated or even converted to, in the case of Peter Feigl, to Christianity, Catholicism. And the question becomes, how do you organize this map? What's so great about it is this incredible wealth and diversity, but that implies a problem, which is like, how do you figure out what it yields if you can't put it in any kind of order? Um, and so I really wanted to think about, what are the attributes, what are the like attributes of this body of material? What's in and what's out? Because there were collections that came, but people mixed diaries and memoirs, and they mixed World War II and Holocaust. And so the challenge was, how do you organize this? So I really wanted to think about what is a diary versus a memoir? What is a what it what are the differences, or what constitutes a Holocaust um, era text, a Jewish or non-Jewish, Jewish or Holocaust victims versus young people in World War II who, like a Christian Dutch boy who experienced the war. That's a very valid and important experience, but he wasn't being targeted by the Germans in the way that a Jew would be, or a Roma, or someone who had a physical disability. So that was a distinction. Diaries and memoirs, of course, we know diaries are written in real time as events occur without a knowledge of the outcome. A memoir is written after the fact. So, but then there's a gray area. Sometimes young people, like, what do you do with a diary, for example, that it's just kind of thin notes written at the time and then revised immediately after the war, or a diary written in 1945 at the time of liberation that recounts everything that occurred until that moment. Is that really a diary? Is that a memoir? Still kind of in the moment. But so there was a lot of sifting, but the most challenging sifting came with the question of age. When do you stop being young? When are you no longer a child? When are you an adult? We know more than ever that this is a fluid process. This is not something that happens once in a moment and then it's over. And so while it was very clear that, a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old was a young person, what do you do with a 22-year-old who's still living with his parents and not, making his own decisions, still living in the structure of his home? What do you do with a 24-year-old who's married and has a baby? Those things can be, you could be young and living an adult life, and it wouldn't really feel appropriate to put those texts with those of a 17 or 16-year-old. But you could be 21 or 22 and be kind of still living at home because of the circumstances and not in charge of your own life, and be very wrestling with very typical adolescent or young adult kinds of questions. So all of those things were the work of many years of trying to, like, as I said, sift through the body of material and say, like, this feels like it really is in the core, this is clearly outside the core, and then kind of there are these gray areas. And that's why I wrote an appendix to the book, which I don't think anyone's ever read, but it's there, that really gets into those gray areas and what's interesting about them and how they reveal what the body of material really yields. Long answer.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute there and it took a minute.
That's
No,
okay.
but I think that really answers a lot of those, kind of preliminary questions of where this was coming from and all the work. I mean, it just seems so daunting. So kind of along those same lines, could you talk a little bit about how these function as both historical and literary sources?
Sure. I mean, that's one of the things that is so great about and so wonderful, and valuable about this body of material is that these diaries function as both of those things at the same time. And it's not so common to have something that does that. So as historical sources, they're very useful for history teachers in that diaries, unlike memoir, and unlike many other sources, tend to, because they're written in real time and because they're written as events occur, what writers include what's important at the moment. And those are things that are important, but they might easily get forgotten or swept away in the broader brush of history over time. So you have a lot of little details and a lot of little texture of daily life that you would not capture from any other source. And that's just enormously valuable. This is the lived experience of a young person. What what did they do with their days? What were their problems? What were their concerns? What were their challenges? How did they grapple with their relationships with their parents or with their friends? Or, how did they think about coming of age? All the kinds of, but also like, where did they work and how did they get clothing and what did they eat on a day-to-day basis? And what was a deportation like? And, like, what about the weather? I mean, this is how we recreate the historical past, it's in the details. And if you've ever tried to write, anything historical, that you need those details. If you don't have those details, you cannot envision what it was like to be in that time. So I think for students in particular, there's a way in which you can really learn to mine these diaries for that historical information and challenge your assumptions about what day-to-day life was like, which is what I love about it. You give a student a primary source and you say, you really can dig in here and find out, not what was happening from 30,000 feet, but what was happening on Tuesday, December 17th, and what does that tell us about the lived experience of this person? At the same time, there are literary sources in that, diary writing is a literary form. Um, and it takes many forms, actually. And you've heard me talk about this before, and probably everybody here has. A diary can be very personal. It can be all about the internal world of the writer, about their feelings, about their thoughts, about their, how they are, emotionally experiencing their lives, or how they're coping with various challenges of identity or personhood. It can be more immediate, which is kind of a broader view of like, what's happening to me and my family right now? What challenges are we facing? How are we managing hunger or displacement or deportation, separation, labor, all the kinds of qualities of the Holocaust experience? But typically, kind of reporting on those events. And then you can have those writers who really take a broader and wider view. What's happening to us as a community? What's happening to us as Jews? What's happening to us in the ghetto? What is the collective experience of our persecution and suffering as a people or as a community? And these tend to be more literary. They take a broader view, like what is the condition of our humanity in this moment? And writers navigate between those worlds. They don't always stay in one. Some people, like if you think about Anne Frank's diary, which so many of us know so well, she writes, and we all know, an enormous amount about her own life, her own personal life, and her relationship with her mother, and her feelings about Peter, and her burgeoning sexuality, and all that. But she also, and this is, I think, kind of a sad thing about the diary, is that this is so dismissed in favor of the personal, but she really does report on their day-to-day lives. She has a day in the life in hiding, which is filled with information about what they did day to day. How did they keep silent? How did they keep, or their encounters with, close encounters with, potentially being found out, or their relationships with their helpers. I mean, these are not about her feelings. They're about how they were surviving. That's like real historical information that matters. And most writers toggle between those worlds. You have sometimes a writer like Moshe Flinker who's almost entirely inside, but not entirely. There's still other things. He goes to see a propaganda movie and reflects on Jewish propaganda. So, but you have to be able to think about like what are the different kinds of writing yield and what can you gain from them? And that's part of the challenge, I think, for English teachers is to be able to untangle those threads a little bit and to be able to say, like, what does a diary yield depending on what the writer is focusing on?
And I think that's why this book is so perfect for both disciplines. I hear social studies teachers who use the diaries. I hear ELA teachers, it used to be more ELA, but more social studies teachers, I think, are picking up on them for the very reasons that you just talked about. They're so versatile for both, really.
And we
Um,
want students to not have a binary view of history and literature. We want them to be able to say, like, a single source can have multiple functions, and you're going to wear a different set of glasses if you're looking at it as a literary source or you're looking at it as a historical source. But those things can both be true.
exactly. Yeah, they meld for sure. So you kind of addressed this in the first part when you were talking about separating the ages of the diarists. But I want you to kind of discuss a little bit about the focus on the youth experience versus that of adults, and maybe give us some examples even that you
Sure.
saw of that. Yeah.
Sure. So, the thing about the thing about I didn't know what was different about young people versus adults when I started working on this book. And bear in mind that I myself was barely out of adolescence. I was in my 20s. I have a very different view of what adolescence is, in particular now being in my 50s and having children and having watched them and continuing to watch them go through this. You do sort of have a perspective. And I think teachers in particular have an added advantage on this topic because you're dealing every day with young people who are this same age. But essentially what I believe is that, adolescence is the project of adolescence is identity formation, right? You're coming into your own, you're figuring out who am I relative to everything I've inherited, my culture, my language, my history, my family, my religion, my nationality, my ethnicity, and then for kids today, my gender, my sexuality, my, neurotype, my, all of these other things that were not articulated as such in these diaries from the 30s and 40s. And the project here is is really about what am I taking from what's been given to me? What am I rejecting? how am I building a sense of who I am and who I want to be in the world? How am I grappling with ideas of faith, ideas of love, friendship, my relationship to my parents, independence, the fundamental questions that face any young person in any period in time. Um, and so but in these diaries, whether they are written during the Holocaust, World War II, or any of the diaries that are written in war and genocide that have surfaced and come down to us, all of that identity formation is taking place against the backdrop of immense turbulence and a sense of um, that some fundamental core of your identity is is part of what is endangering you. So, like Jewish identity for these young people was a mortal threat. And yet one has to come to terms with that. Like, what does it mean to be Jewish? How do I understand my Jewish identity? Did I like being a Jew? Did I not like being a Jew? Did I feel Jewish? How Jewish? Was I religious? Was I not religious? Was I culturally identified? Do I love the Jewish people? How do I feel about Israel? All of these things kind of thread through this body of material. And I'll give you just one or two quick examples, and then I can read a diary entry, or given the time, this is actually probably a diary entry that everybody already knows. So who's on this call, but I will just speak to a couple of examples. One is there's a just a couple of fragments of a diary that survived by a young woman called Janina Bauman, and they were published in her memoir, which is called Winter in the Morning. And she was in Warsaw, passing as a non-Jew, I believe. I think that's right. And she had her mother had copied some of her diary entries, and that's how they survived. The original diary is lost. But there's this one entry where she talks about how she has this only one dress, and it's a red dress, and it's too small. Her breasts are getting too big, and her butt and her, she doesn't say butt, but she's outgrowing this dress. It's too small, it's very tight. And she didn't want to wear it. And so she told her mother, um, I don't want to wear this dress because there's this crazy guard who goes all around in Warsaw and just shoots people. And if I call attention to myself in this dress, he might shoot me. And so her mother lends her instead this beautiful gray dress that she has. And she says, I look amazing and feel horrible. And that is such an amazing example to me of how something that is totally typical adolescent issue and challenge about body changes and identity and self-consciousness and wanting to look a certain way gets distorted by the circumstances and then raises a sort of moral dilemma for her. So I think that example always comes to mind. There's another one in the diary of David Rabinowitz, and I'm trying here because I can see that so many of these people have heard me speak so many times. I'm trying to think of ones that maybe I don't always talk about. Um, David Rabinowitz, who got in a fight with his father, and his father was kind of a rough, they were a peasant family, kind of a rough guy. And, David he was out doing chores and he didn't clean up properly, and the father came and beat him. And he writes in this one entry about just how unjust it was, how unfair it was, and how he cried and how ashamed he felt. And that is just, again, typical in some ways. And yet, you imagine the father has so many stresses and so many burdens that, David himself couldn't even begin to imagine. And so the entry that I was thinking about reading, but I think watching the time, I think I'm going to pass over that one, is the Diary of the Anonymous Girl writing about hunger, which is sort of the classic entry that I almost always read, which is really about she's so hungry. She has this moral dilemma. She needs to feed her body. She's taking the food from her family. She's taking more than she's entitled to. And she has so much shame and so much pain over that. And the way that she responds to that is so typically adolescent. She blames herself. We would be a happy family if I didn't fight with everybody. All the problems are started by me. I'm at fault. Why can't I do the right thing? And we all know this is how adolescents feel. They can be, their parents get divorced and they think it's their fault. It exists across time and place, this kind of solipsistic, narcissistic view of adolescence, which is evolutionarily necessitated. They need to feel that way. They need to prioritize and view the world through their own lens in order to create their identities and in order to survive. But the downside of that is that, they tend to also have an exaggerated sense of their own importance, and they tend to blame themselves for things that are not their fault, or take responsibility for things, or have trouble having a sense of proportion about their actions vis-a-vis the people around them. And so all of that, yeah, as I always say, and many of you have probably heard me say this, you can't opt out of adolescence just because you're living through a war, just because you're living through genocide. You don't opt out. That is a developmental process that has to take place in every person, no matter what else they might be going through. And so the fact that it emerges in these diaries is not surprising, but I think it's important because it means that these historical and literary sources have history and literature in them, but they also have this layer of the lens of adolescence, and that is so particular and so fleeting that it's very rare to have, such a wealth of material that, that allows us to see history through that point of view.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes it relatable to our students,
Right.
that they're not in that situation, thank goodness, but they can relate to these other pieces, and it's a human piece,
Yes,
right, that we
absolutely.
see.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's exactly what it is, that they see themselves and they see the vulnerability and the confusion and the complexity and we can all kind of try to remember what it felt like to be 18 or 20, and the world seems overwhelming and confusing, and you're trying to make your way and you're trying to do your best, but there you don't have that wisdom yet. You don't have the perspective. You simply don't have it. And that's there's a lot of suffering that comes with that, I think.
exactly. Yes. And I don't know if you want to address this, but I know that there's continuing research on the diarists and such, and I know some things, in the last year or so have come to light.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to share any of
Yeah,
that
I'm
since you
happy
had the
to.
anonymous girl.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about other diaries from war and genocide, but I can just jump in and say that interestingly, over the last few years, I've come across many, many, many diaries kept, ongoing new diaries from the Holocaust, new diaries from World War II, new diaries written by, not new, but diaries that I didn't know about that were written by teenagers in other wars and genocides, and also diaries that were written by teenagers in other times and places that are not wartime. So Colleen Tambucio, who's on with us just the other day, sent me information about a diary that neither of us had ever heard of, and I'm going to get her name, which is very hard to pronounce. Miriam, I think it's Chazhevaka, who was from Radomsko, who was murdered in 1942. And she writes this. I wrote this down. She writes this in her diary. It's so silly, but as I'm about to die, I worry about my diary. I don't want it burned or tossed away. I want someone, even a German, to find and read it. And when we get into the Q&A, I'd love for Colleen to speak a little bit about a project that a teacher did with this. There are also diaries from Ukraine that have come to light recently. One, and I'm looking at my notes because I have to remember how to say the names. Yeva Skalietska, who was 12 years old and wrote in Kharkiv in 22. Timothy Zozulia, who wrote in another smaller village in Ukraine, who lost his mother and stepfather. There was an exhibition that was put on in Amsterdam of 14 or 15 diaries of teenagers who wrote in the Ukraine war. And then there recently, within the last few years, no, I guess it was during the pandemic, there was a book published of 35 diaries kept by teenagers in World War II, Russian teenagers, all Russian. 14 diaries kept by young people in the siege of Leningrad. And these were excerpted in this gigantic volume. And then a couple of others that I want to just mention. There is a diary of a Jewish teenager called Alexander Galat who wrote many, many journals in 1925 in Harbin, China. He was living in this Jewish community in Harbin, China. There's Rosie Phillips, who was an American Jewish teenager writing in New York in the 1920s and teens and 20s, I think. There's an 18-year-old boy called Enoch Cloud in the 1800s who wrote on a whaling vessel who kept a diary. There are three Civil War diaries by teenagers, 18, 19 years old. And then there are the diaries of famous people. Theodore Roosevelt kept a diary as a boy. Sylvia Plath kept a diary. Edna St. Vincent Millay kept a diary. I read a ton of nonfiction, and I cannot tell you the number of times I find out that somebody who, was a in some, worthy of having a book written about them kept a diary as a teenager. So I think there's so much more than we even realize, things that are coming out now and things that, that are what's never been done is to put them all together and to look at them as, all of these together. But there's a lot of exciting things coming out. So, yes.
That's
And-
amazing. Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. I was just writing these all down.
Yeah. Yeah. No, believe me, I've got a list. Colleen and I are working on it.
Yes,
Trying to keep that
exactly.
master list going. It's crazy how much
It's
stuff there.
daunting. Oh
Yeah,
my
it is.
gosh.
It is. It's true.
Well, so you were talking about these other diaries from other times and such. And we mentioned the Houston exhibition
Yeah.
from just a few years ago. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I want to share a couple of entries from that exhibition because what was great about that exhibition, they wanted to have a permanent exhibition about youth diaries and the Holocaust, but it was an opportunity to expand it to war and genocide because I had not really done that. There was a great um, book by Filipovich, who famously wrote Zlata's diary about the war in Bosnia. And she did a volume called Stolen Voices that I highly recommend that has excerpts of many different diaries in them. There's some Holocaust diaries. It's a little bit of a hodgepodge. It's not quite as, I would say, rigid in terms of like how you're separating war, genocide, but it's a incredible source, and I leaned on it very heavily for the exhibition. And one of the most interesting, actually, pairs of diaries in that book are there's a diary of a Jewish teenager in Israel and a Palestinian teenager, both writing during either the first or second Intifada. I think it might have been the second Intifada. But you have like two teenagers on opposite sides of this conflict documenting their daily life. And that's enormously valuable and powerful. There's also the diary of Stanley Hayami, which I don't know if that's in her book, but we included it in the Houston exhibition, who wrote as a teenager in a Japanese American internment camp, which is a very important and very, very beautiful and meaningful diary. And he ended up losing his life fighting for America in the war. Um, so, we wanted to look more broadly and what are the relationships between the Holocaust diaries and World War II and diaries kept by other teenagers. And of course, there were many. Um, the substance is related in exactly the ways you would expect. There are similar kinds of challenges of survival and similar kinds of issues around family and coming of age. But what was so interesting is that as we moved out of the 90s and into the 2000s, the diaries began to take a new form. So diaries would sometimes be written as a blog, or technology started to play a role. And so I want to share my screen to share two diaries. There's one by a young girl called Hadiya, that's her pseudonym, who wrote during the Iraq War. And she wrote her diary as a blog. And one of the things I want to say about this is that an analog diary, which is all the diaries up until the Bosnian War, are what I would call analog, right? They're one volume, one writer, one pen, one notebook. And those diaries have the virtue of having created an artifact. In addition to the substance of the text, the diaries, there's an artifact, there's an actual physical object that tells its own story about survival. And sometimes there are pictures pasted in it, or drawings, or doodles, or other kinds of notes, or things are scratched out. There's a whole other layer that we could talk about forever about that. Um, Digital diaries don't have that. They exist in the ether, right? There's no actual physical object. Analog diaries, you had to you have to preserve that diary and hope that that diary gets found and that it then gets somehow manages to go to wherever somebody who will understand what it is and will publish it and share it. Diaries that are written in a digital form, in particular on the internet, are written in real time, but they're also instantly available to the entire world. The news is getting out not 5, 10, 20 years after it occurred, but as it's happening. And the writer can be in conversation with her readers. And that is totally different. The writers who wrote in Salvaged Pages, they're in conversation with their readers in many ways, but it's not a two-way conversation. They are, addressing a reader, but they're obviously have no, so I want to share this diary. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see how this goes. This is always like the moment of truth. Is it going to work? Share. Let's see. Was I successful? Yay. Yay me. Okay, let me just get that out of the way. So this is Hadia, who was writing in Mosul, in Iraq, in 2004, shortly after the invasion of American forces or Allied forces, due to the weapons of mass destruction in the Bush administration, second Bush administration. And so this is an entry that she wrote, and she wrote it as a letter, and I'll read it, and then we can talk about it. Dear America, don't ask me any questions about what's happening in Mosul because the situation is bad. Thank you, America, for your help. You have made my life more difficult than it was, worse than it was. We are more scared now. I should ask you a question. What do you do when someone enters your house without your permission? I mean, enters by force. Tell me, what do you do? I would be a liar if I told you I couldn't sleep last night because I was so sad. The truth is that I couldn't sleep because the Americans were bombarding our neighborhood. What should I say? I have so many words I want to write, but I can't. Until when must we follow what America says? How long must we follow orders? Who is America? Ha! We have the oldest civilization. We have oil, and we have the capability to rule ourselves. I respect the American people who are not with this war. I respect the American people who love Iraq and want peace. I respect the American people my parents talked to me about. They lived in America 20 years ago, and they admire the American people, but not the Americans who have come to Iraq now, not them. So this is a completely different kind of voice. She is writing in real time, and of course, because she was writing in a blog in real time, she got answers from people. And she got hostile answers from people who did not appreciate, that she did not appreciate, the fact that the Americans were coming in to save the Iraqi people from Saddam Hussein. So, you know, the the substance of it sounds very, there's so much that you could say about it. Her and it was really interesting. Actually, this is I had forgotten about this, but this was an interesting one because we had some debate when we were putting the exhibition together about, was this going to be too offensive for Americans at a Holocaust museum in Houston to have this perspective? And how would veterans feel? Veterans of the war, would they be insulted? Would they? And, in the end, I really came down on this thing of it's not for us. This is what she felt. This is the truth of her experience. You can agree, you can disagree, you can argue the point, but the reality is that if you want to understand what it was like for her in this moment, this is what she experienced, and you can't really argue, that she was wrong to feel what she felt. And that's what a diary does. It has that quality of like, this is my lived experience, and I have the right and the authority to say what that is, even if it offends people or makes people angry. And then the other diary entry that I'd love to share is by another anonymous writer called Samer, writing under ISIS in 2014 in Raqqa, Syria. And again, to go back to technology, you'll see in this entry, he was kind of in a sort of underground cell that was trying to get news out of Syria about what was happening under ISIS, because ISIS had everything in such a lockdown. And the way that he did it was that he would send these encrypted messages to another country. And then they would be sent to this BBC reporter, Mike Thompson, who ended up publishing them. So this is 2014. It's an undated entry, but in the year 2014. And I'll read this. And Daesh refers to, that's what they called ISIS in Syria. So Daesh always hurries to the location, or Daesh always, sorry, hurry to the location of an airstrike as soon as it happens to stop us civilians going near it. Not because they fear for our safety, but to prevent any media activists from taking photographs and sharing them with the outside world. After all, this would be proof of the awful situation we live in. It's very similar to the way the regime behaved. Living through the tyranny of the regime taught me some vital lessons that have been useful during life under Daesh, but these new tyrants rule with an even tighter grip. I have got together with some young guys I met during the first popular protests against the regime. These activists have stayed in the city since Daesh took over. We all agree that something has to be done and that we should shoulder the responsibility to make it happen. Riyadh has assigned roles to each of us. My role is uploading social media messages and blogs we've written and getting them out of Raqqa. I go to an internet cafe and upload what we have stored on my mobile. The cafes are always full of Daesh's security guys and they execute media activists, so we have to be very careful. My material is sent to an intermediary who passes it on to my friend Mokles on the outside. He is then able to publish it online. We want this outside world to know what is happening, things they might not otherwise imagine, like the executions and stonings and casualties from airstrikes. We want to tell those who have fled Raqqa how our city is coping. You know, there's so much in this entry that sounds like it could have been written by a teenager during the Holocaust who wanted the world to know what was happening, but there was no mechanism for it. So it was like, I'm documenting this for posterity. And I'm hoping that someday someone will find it and know what we lived through, versus this version where he is taking his life in his hands every single minute that he does this in order. And there's a moral imperative to get the news out to the world, one that he has chosen to risk his life to do. And through the rest of the diary, you see the increasing strain on him, the intense anxiety, the fear that he's being followed, that he's being blacklisted. And eventually, you know, he decides that he can't do it anymore because, you know, he's too much in fear for his life and it's too much stress and strain on his mother. And so he stops. But you know, again, I think you can see there is a kind of there's something analogous to some of the diary entries that we all know from Salvaged Pages and from the other diaries that have been published. This idea that living this experience in isolation, or the idea that people might not know what happened, amplifies the pain and suffering of the experience itself.
And do you think, because I think we could definitely see the similarities, Samara is asking, is there something in the handwritten diaries that's different from the online, digital versions?
Yeah, I mean, I think diaries that are written in an analog form, I think by definition have a more interiority. You know, there is something about these are almost like a quad, they're like, it's almost like it could be like a letter. You know, it's a diary, but it's a letter. It's because there is an avenue and it's intended for an outside reader. Not every diary written during the Holocaust some were intended for outside readers, and they hoped that their people would find their diaries, and some did not, and they said this explicitly. So I think there is something different. And then in terms of the handwriting, definitely there's something, I mean, when you encounter an artifact kept by somebody that has their handwritten, words, the individuality of their handwriting, the water stains, the sense that this thing has gone through a journey, that artifact has a lot of power and it tells its own story. And the digital does not have that. It's very different. The substance can be very meaningful, but it does have that sort of sanitized quality, I think, of anything that we read online.
Yeah, and I think that's why I know when working with students, when they would see a photograph of a handwritten diary and see it written in the language, they always thought that was so cool
Yeah,
because what we're looking at on the screen, we do look at that all day, right? And
yeah,
so it was so unique to them, I think, to see the
yeah.
different handwriting and then
And there's
speaking
kind of authenticity and intimacy about the handwritten word. No two people's
of this,
handwriting is exactly the same. And so, yeah, you feel like, oh, I'm really encountering something that was made by an individual, and I can feel that, which you don't feel when you're seeing a printed text.
right? Yeah, it's more human in a way. Um, and so my friend David Cater is asking about for the entries you just shared, translations. Were these translated or were these written in English?
Um, I believe that I'm not sure about Samir's diary. Hadia, I am pretty sure she wrote in English
Yeah,
because she was writing in her blog.
yeah,
I don't know if Samir was writing in English and it was then translated. I'm sure it says in the book. The book is called The
yeah.
Rocker Diaries. I don't remember. Yeah,
Okay, great. Yeah. So I know with Salvaged Pages, that was a huge endeavor getting all of that translated and
absolutely. And it remains a
ooh,
challenge. You know, it remains a challenge. There's a lot of material from other diarists, other diaries that I know about that have never been translated into English. And because, now, it's so interesting though. Now it's so different. Like at the time, translation was incredibly laborious and expensive and time consuming. And now we have these AI tools that probably could render many of these texts in a readable form very quickly and very easily. Um, so that may be one of the few things that I don't hate about AI. But I think the idea that it might be able to be employed in a way that would make this content more accessible is definitely exciting.
yeah. So I would love for you to talk a little bit about the Dispatches project.
Sure. Um, I will stop the share for just 1 second and just speak about it, and then I'll show you my screen. So this is a project that's close to my heart, not only because of what we did, but because who I got to do it with, Kim, Colleen, Kate, from EIHR. We really uh, we found ourselves in this moment in COVID, and it was clear that we were living through something that was a historical moment. We were living through our own historical time, a very specific historical time. And And we started thinking, what would young people, what is the equivalent to Salvage Pages? Like, what would young people have to say about their lives in the pandemic? Um, and how could we create a project that would give young people an avenue to do this? So I'm going to share my screen and share how we did it. I would say that it was a fascinating project and we learned a lot. And it was a sort of a first attempt to do something that I think we've continued to try to figure out. Colleen and I have done together with EIHR another iteration of this project, but trying to figure out like, how would you, if you wanted to get hundreds or thousands of teenagers to sustain a practice of journal writing, how would you do that? So we couldn't do it quite on that level. We did it fast. It was pandemic. It was, but I'm going to share my screen and I'll show you. Um, I'm actually going to go back here to show first. So this is the dispatches page on my website. Um, And it explains sort of what the idea was, trying to give teens an opportunity to share their thoughts about their ideas. And the way that we did it was to create prompts. And we used diaries that were written by teenagers during the Holocaust and other wars and genocides to try to say, like, this is how a young person wrote about this idea. What is your version of this in your experience? And we got, and I don't think I think I have the prompt. Yeah, here are the prompts. It's just to give you an idea of what they were. So you read the diary entry in the prompt, then you respond, and then you submit. So like the first one that we did was just this one writer saying, I decided to write a diary, though it's a bit too late To recompit the past events is quite impossible. So I begin with the present. And so then we said, like, okay, what is that for you? How do you begin with the present? Where are you in quarantine? What are you experiencing? What are your problems? What are your concerns? So that's the way that we did these prompts, was to sort of link them to an existing body of material and then translate that to the present day circumstances. And then once we got about 300 or so entries from young people over a 6-week period. And then we went through them, we curated it, and we put together this gallery. And I'll just give you a sense of, here's one entry by Isabel Boyer. Panic on the news, panic from the schools, panic from my parents, panic from the people, drowning in panic. For what? I had no time to process the situation. Quarantine had become faster than I could wrap my head around anything, leaving me with unanswered questions, leaving me in shock. The virus spread faster than ever before. There's a virus and it's deadly. I'm declaring this a national emergency. Due to these unprecedented times, stay inside, stock up now, 6 feet apart, no mask, no entry. The nation as a whole is in quarantine. They just announced a stay-at-home order. And what was so interesting is that in these entries that we got, you know, young people, we learned a lot, actually, even from just a handful of entries. Some young people wrote about the hardships, but some young people wrote about what it was like to be forced to slow down and to get a reprieve from the grind of their daily lives, and I think what was telling about that was to realize how much stress teenagers are under, college, and having to, work so hard to go to school and have a job and support themselves and do their extracurriculars and, keep up with their families and all these other things. Something about the reprieve from that made that bubble up in a way that we may not have noticed or seen. So we also had here, this is a lovely little song that a young woman wrote. We had some artwork by Lily. Here's one by Lily Packowit, which is like, gives you a sense of like, here's this girl and what is happening, her overwhelm in her mind during the pandemic. So an amazing poem. So we had a real range. We invited not only journal entries, but poems, songs, artwork. I love this one. Go to my room, get ready to be productive, but get distracted. Play Animal Crossing for the next 6 hours. I think everybody can relate to that. So anyway, this is you can go to my website and read all of these entries. I think they can be great for teachers to use as a way to prompt reflection on the pandemic, to read through or choose one and reflect on how you remember what you might have experienced at the time. And that I think, and then there's also, I know I just saw Colleen posted the piece on Morning Edition about it, which has some of these young writers reading aloud their own entries. Here's the last thing I'll say. A part of me is grateful for this pandemic. For the first time in many months, I open my window all the way and I pull up the blinds. I am met with birdsong. And I think we can all remember that as hard as it was, as stressful as it was, as frightening as it was, there was something about the slowdown of the world, hearing nature, being forced to be quiet, being forced to be alone with your family, or for some people alone with themselves, which could be very difficult. But, we got off the treadmill for a minute. And, and some writers write about not just the context, but the actual illness, getting sick or losing a loved one or somebody that they loved who had been sick, because, that's something that, obviously that was the core of the experience was illness and death, not just the ways in which we tried to protect ourselves from it.
Thanks for sharing that, Alex. I agree. It's such a cool project. And I think it speaks to a couple of things. There was a question in the chat box about I guess, validity of having students, look at Holocaust diaries or others, and then, be prompted to keep their own. And I think there's such value in that on so many levels. And so I'll ask my last question, and that is, kind of twofold. What do you tell young people about expressing themselves, especially during times of crisis or conflict? And then how can teachers help facilitate that message?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the main message really is that, for me and for all of us who work with teachers who work with students or who work with students directly, this fundamental thing of, we believe that you have something to say. We believe you have something to say now, like not when you grow up, not later, but right now. And that what you say right now about your lives really matters, and that the world needs young people to be part of that conversation about what is happening in the world. I think as teenagers are historically marginalized and, kind of ignored or dismissed and kind of viewed as not really, because they're in a stage of transition that they don't really have, that they shouldn't really be taken seriously. And that's like the exact opposite of what I believe. And that what most of us believe if we work with young people. And so I think the message is, that first, that you have something to say. And second, that there is a very democratic, fairly easy um, way to do it, which is to pick up a pencil or a pen and pick up a journal and start observing what is happening around you and reflecting on what you see, describing what you see. So the sort of the framework that we used for another iteration of dispatches was this observe, describe, reflect, repeat. So it's like the training the muscle or the practice of like, first of all, what am I seeing? First of all, what's happening around me? Second of all, how do I describe that? How do I put that into words? And third, how do I reflect on it? It's not just, it's what happened and so what, right? Like what is it, what happened and then why does what happened matter? Why does it matter to you? Why does it matter to the world? And so I've used that model in a number of different settings, and I think it's very helpful because it leads to that, accounting of what's happening and then reflecting on what's happening, which is ultimately what a journal practice is about. And then sort of being able to say to people, this is a practice. This is a muscle. This is something that you do over time. It's not something that you do once and you're done, and the more you do it, the more you get good at doing it, the more you find the through lines of your own life, you find the stories, you find growth, you find change, you view things differently than you did before, you see the change in the world. If that's what you're documenting, you have a good day, you have a bad day, but that there's something both enormously valuable for the individual self in the practice, and there's something valuable for the historical record in keeping a record. And so that's what I think it is. And that's what I hope that teachers would impart to their students, especially when they're teaching diaries or using these kinds of sources with students, to be able to say, hundreds of other teenagers have done this all around the world, all throughout history. And we know things that we would never know about the world had they not done it. And there is no reason why you can't do it too.
Yeah, and I love Colleen mentioned, imagine if, we did this as a practice across all disciplines in school because it's such a great way to reflect,
Yes.
right? And to just think about and process. And yeah, I love that.
And yes, and to teach young people that in some ways you're in dialogue with yourself. What does your internal voice sound like? Who are you when you're just with you, grappling with your own questions, not performatively on social media, not the image that you want to project, which young people are so vulnerable to, but like, who are you vis-a-vis yourself? What is your internal voice? How do you ask your questions? How do you grapple with what is important to you? It's so valuable to do that in daily life and anytime. It's not just a time of, a sort of important historical moment, but the time that any time that we're living in, because every time that we're living in ultimately is going to be history.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, one final question. Somebody just
Yes.
messaged me. And
Okay.
they wanted to know, will there ever be a Salvaged Pages 2?
Oh God. Um, I don't think that there will be a Salvaged Pages 2 in the in the sense of sort of a second volume of that book. I have a lot of ideas about, I would love to do a digital archive of youth diaries, um, including all of the diaries that I've been able to identify. I would love to create a youth journaling platform that would have a very robust and meaningful way for young people to develop a journaling practice, but also to take advantage of, the power of the internet and communication to be able to make that happen, and then to be able to leverage all of that substance for education and for advocacy. So I have a vision for something like that. Um, I think in today's time and place, that has more utility perhaps than a second volume of Salvaged Pages. But I will say, it may not be for me to do it. I have other books that I'm working on and projects that I'm doing and ways in which I'm continuing to explore what these diaries can yield. But if somebody else wanted to do another volume with other diaries that had been kept either during this time or elsewhere, I think that could be useful. And there are other volume two. If you think about, this diary from the Russian teenagers or Stolen Voices or, other anthologies out there of other diaries. Those are the volume twos of Salvaged Pages. They just weren't done by me.
Yes, exactly. Well, Alex, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your time. This has been amazing.
Thank
Just
you.
so
I'm
great
sorry
hearing
if I
from you.
took up all the question time. I hope people got some of their questions answered in the course of this talk, but I've just really enjoyed it. It was great to be able to get into some of the things that I often don't have time to talk about. So thank you. And thanks for being such a great interlocutor, Kim.
My pleasure. It's always a pleasure with you, Alex.
Thanks. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, Alex, so much. And on behalf of the rest of the board at EIHR, we really appreciate all that you do to support the work.
Thank you.
And along those lines, if you enjoyed a free webinar and you have the capacity, please consider donating to EIHR to support this kind of programming, as well as the work that we do with teachers around the world in partnership. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.